And sure enough, the meter's going like this, on and off. All of instruments are going on and off. And I realized then it was the carbon pile regulator. That was the problem, because when you get thin air at altitude, the carbon pile would short out, which then cut your voltage off, and you were through. That was what regulated that to 24 to 28 volts. So I says, I believe you now. And he did one of these. And I started heaving from the minute he went over. And I knew that if I heaved all over the plane, I'd have a hell of a time cleaning it up in the consoles and stuff and under the flooring. So I went like this. And I actually wound up, I heaved so much that I had bile in my socks. But I didn't spread it all around the cockpit. I got it all within me. And I couldn't get out of the airplane when we landed because I was so airsick, because he went spiraling down just like this and landed. So I cleaned myself up, changed clothes and everything, went out, apologized to him, changed the carbon pile, and then fixed the airplane. That was my first jet ride. I've been in jets many, many times after that. I made 4 catapult shots off the ship in the back of an F4F Phantom. So I will get back to the air age again of what was happening between 1950 and 1960. That was the prop age switching into jets. The first jet airplane that I saw or worked on was the FJ1, which was made by, not Grumman at the time, it was made by McDonnell. And it had a jet engine in it, and you started it by putting cartridges into a folder, and when he hit that cartridge igniter, gas came out, cranked the engine enough to where he could hit the igniter at a certain RPM, and if everything worked, the jet engine would have enough RPM and enough heat back there to start burning the jet fuel. Later, they came out with the FJ. It was the F2H, which was an upgraded version of the original FJ1. Now, the F2H had an air starter built into it. You had to take a jet cart alongside the aircraft, plug in a big rubber hose, and start the jet engine or start a cartridge in a jet start, which would give you enough gas to crank the aircraft engine, the air starter, to get the engine up to speed enough to where he could hit the fuel and igniter. He'd open the throttle to idle, he'd hit the igniter, and if everything worked, a big flame came out the back end, and the aircraft then would slowly get up to RPM. The back end flame would go away, and if it didn't go away, then the paint on the side of the aircraft would start to bubble and burn. So we needed something better than what we had. We went through a series of aircraft in the 50s that every aircraft manufacturer cranked out 1 or 2 versions. And we went through all the series learning about jets. The maintenance people had to learn about jets. We were all ex-prop people. Jets were all new to everybody. You had to go, they created a Naval Air Maintenance Training Program where you would go into a classroom and learn your specialty in the classroom in relation to that jet. My first classroom was on the F7F Gutless Cutlass. Now, they bought the Cutlass with twin-engine jet engines. And it was so underpowered because the Air Force snapped up all of the available higher jet-powered thrust engines. The J-34s and stuff that they had in there, you had to start with a jet engine or a cartridge, get the thing moving up fast enough with enough heat in there to get ignited so that it would burn and continue to accelerate. Once you got the one engine started, you switch over and try to start the other engine. And the school that I went to was 3 weeks long because I was going to be the maintenance chief again in that particular squadron. I wasn't too happy to be in an F7U squadron. The aircraft had a 14-foot nose strut. And when it tried to land on a carrier, the pilot couldn't see over the front to see where he was going. So they had to develop a way at the factory that they could put in what they call a landing eye. They took the nose of the aircraft and bent it down into a landing position. Even though the aircraft angle of attack was high, the nose would crank down to where he could look out and see the ship. Well, that proved one night on a night landing as I watched it land, where he got a burble at the same time we got a nose dip on the carrier, and he hit the round down, which is the rear of the carrier. It comes down, and then below that is a platform, and where the hangar deck comes out and actually projects out the rear of the carrier. That's where we could take an engine and dry run the engine out of an airplane on the fantail so that it wouldn't interfere with any of the elevator operations around the rest of the ship. The pilot hit the round down, the plane broke up, the engines and the cockpit came up the flight deck, the rest of the aircraft went into the hangar deck. Big ball of fire followed the cockpit, big ball of fire at the hangar deck. And I was at that time on the flight deck as a troubleshooter. That was before I was a maintenance chief. As a troubleshooter up there, I was first class. I had two other guys with me, and we had positioned ourselves all the way over on the angled deck so that we could watch the landing on the straight deck, because they were landing, catching a wire, and coming up. And the fireball from the fuel tanks just after the cockpit, where it broke apart, came up the flight deck. We ducked down because we were in the port catapult, not catapult, but the port catwalk. And they have catwalks on both sides of the flight deck. and that is your bailout spot when there's trouble. So we ducked down in that angled deck catwalk. We watched the airplane explode, come up the deck in a ball of flame, and we watched the pilot try to get out of the cockpit, which broke away from the aircraft and slid all the way up, almost went over the bow, but it stopped. The rest of the aircraft stopped when it tangled up into the wires. So the pilot, when we looked up over at the pilot as they were getting him out, his whole suit was nothing but a glowing red, looked like a glowing red charcoal. The fire guys are in flame-proof suits, and they set along the island, so when there's a crash, they have cutters and axes and stuff to where they can run out, get the pilot out of the seat and everything. And that's what we watched, them getting out of the seat while the fuel gang turned into the... when the blue shirts normally operate, they run the fuel hoses to the airplane. When there's a fire, they run the fire hoses and everything to the fire. While they were rigging the fire hoses and everything, try to get the fire under control, the hot suit guys got up there on the cockpit, got the pilot out, threw him on the hangar deck, or not a hangar, but the flight deck, and he looked like he was a glowing cigarette from head to toe. One of the hose guys was smart enough to hit him with a hose and put the cinder out. The two guys in the fire suits picked them up, one under each arm, and ran to the island structure with them. The next time I saw that pilot was in the mess. The only place he was burned was on his wrist and right here on his neck where he had a bandage. His flight suit was a Nomex flight suit, which all the pilots wore at that time frame. So when they crashed and they had a fire, that it was protecting them to a certain amount. They got the hose team to put that cinders all over out before it actually physically burned his body, except where the Nomex flight suits did not meet. His ankles were burned, his wrists were burned, and his neck. But he was down there in the chow hall, and they walked through one section of the chow hall. The chiefs walked through the section where the opposite side of them, and I saw him down there, and he was talking to everybody, and we thought, fantastic, he lived. I was about 30 feet from him, maybe 40 feet from him at the time, on the catwalk, watching the whole episode until the fireball started from the fuel that was still in the wings that came along with the fuselage started to come forward. Then we ducked down and found a way through the maze to get over to the other side of the island.